Welcome to the 2021 China Town Hall. I'm Patrick Ryan, President of the Tennessee World Affairs Council. Today, we're pleased to bring you a special program organized in association with the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations in Washington, D.C. And we are always happy to tell you that our program partners are the Center for International Business at Belmont University and the Nashville Area Chamber of Commerce. Thanks to them for their support of global affairs awareness programs in our communities. Our plan is to bring you a panel of experts on U.S.-China relations, U.S. foreign policy, U.S. trade and investment, and national security issues. Our panel is Mr. Jeremy Goldkorn, Professor Thomas Schwartz, and Mr. John Scannapieco. More on them shortly. At 6 p.m. Central Time, we will shift our venue from Nashville, Tennessee to Washington, D.C. for the broadcast of the National Committee. They will present Mr. Fareed Zakaria, CNN host of the Global Public Square, author and prolific columnist and reporter. He will examine the challenges and opportunities for both countries as they confront the most critical issues of the 21st century. We will provide you the link to the Zakaria broadcast so you can watch it directly on your browser, or you can stay with our Zoom feed for the broadcast with the opportunity to share your comments in the chat stream. Last housekeeping notes. For our Nashville panel of experts, please ask questions. Please ask questions. The benefit of these webinars is for you to be engaged, so start early on with your questions and please use the Q&A tab on the screen. Questions in the chat box may not be seen and answered. And may I take the liberty of briefly telling you about the World Affairs Council. We are an independent, nonpartisan, educational, nonprofit association. We were organized as a citizen-based public service to help inform the community on global affairs. We do programs like this in our in-person hosting of the Japanese ambassador on November 2nd. And we will work with high schools and universities to promote global awareness. We have an extensive library of programs at youtube.com/TNWAC, and our podcasts are in the Global Tennessee series, wherever you get your pods. And like other nonprofit groups, we rely on you to help us to keep the lights on. So I invite you to become a member of TNWAC. You'll get the world famous World Affairs coffee mug, or become a donor. Just $5 a month. Your gift will make a big difference in supporting our programming. Thank you very much. On to China. This afternoon's crop of email included a note from Foreign Affairs editor Daniel Kurtz-Phelan with word of the new issue. In the tease, he wrote this. In September, in his first address to the UN General Assembly as president, Joe Biden pledged that the United States was, quote, was not seeking a new Cold War or a world divided into rigid blocs, unquote. That pledge was echoed in different words by Biden's Chinese counterpart, Xi Jinping, and reinforced by warnings from a slew of other leaders about the grim consequences of a world split into warring camps. Yet, rather than offering reassurance, this chorus served mostly to highlight just how dismal the geopolitical reality has become, with suspicion and acrimony threatening to sink trust and cooperation, even in the face of shared existential challenges. That is the U.S.-China relationship in 2021. To examine these issues and take your questions, we have Jeremy Goldkorn. He's the editor-in-chief of SupChina and co-host of the Sinica podcast. He moved to China in 1995 and became managing editor of Beijing's first independent English language entertainment magazine. In 2003, he founded the website and research firm Danwei, which tracked Chinese media, markets, politics, and business. It was acquired in 2013 by the Financial Times. He has lived in a workers' dormitory, produced a documentary film about African soccer players in Beijing, and rode a bicycle from Peshawar to Kathmandu via Kashgar and Lhasa. He moved to Nashville, Tennessee in 2015 and is a board member of the Tennessee China Network and a President's Advisory Board member of the Tennessee World Affairs Council. John Scannapieco is an attorney at Womble Bond Dixon US LLP. He is a global business specialist and a member of the board, Tennessee World Affairs Council. He assists both U.S. and foreign businesses engaged in the global economy. For more than 3 decades, he has provided strategic guidance and counsel to businesses and individuals regarding their existing global operations or to those contemplating expansion. John's practice is focused on cross-border transactions. He assists domestic and foreign clients in connection with global legal issues in the United States, Central and South America, Europe, and Asia. He also advises companies that are contemplating pursuing a strategy in China, as well as companies that are currently doing business in China or with Chinese businesses. John has also worked with several companies in connection with the expansion of their global workforce. John serves as honorary consul from Great Britain and Northern Ireland in Tennessee. Thomas Schwartz is Distinguished Professor of History, Vanderbilt University. He is a historian of the foreign relations of the United States with related interest in American politics, the history of international relations, modern European history, and biography. His most recent book is Henry Kissinger and American Power, a Political Biography. Professor Schwartz has held fellowships from the Social Science Research Council, the German Historical Society, the Norwegian Nobel Institute, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and the Center for the Study of European Integration. He has served as president of the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations. He served on the United States Department of State's Historical Advisory Committee as the representative of the Organization of American Historians from 2005 to 2008. Thank you all for being with us today. And again, for our audience, we have put together a panel of experts on U.S.-China relations, and I am really looking forward to their discussion and your questions this evening. Let's begin our conversation on U.S.-China relations and how they affect our country and our communities. Jeremy, you spend every day digging into developments in China, everything you need to know today, as the supchina.com website says. Give us our opening context on what's happening in contemporary China that we should have as we build on our understanding of the relationship.
Well, I think perhaps in past events last year, you've covered obviously the widening gap between the United States and China in many ways. But inside China itself, there are a lot of changes afoot too at the moment. And many of them, like changes elsewhere in the world, have been accelerated by COVID. Some of them were probably happening anyway. And all of them are under the control of Xi Jinping, who is going to probably prove to be one of the world's longest ruling leaders of any country by the time he's done, who has continued to consolidate power in his hands and has come out of COVID-19 looking quite well with much of the general public, as well as the sort of chattering classes, apparently approving of the country's handling of the pandemic. And at the same time, you have an acceleration of various crackdowns that were going on all kinds of industries and areas of life, ranging from internet companies to wealthy individuals who may not be paying taxes, to labor conditions, also often at internet companies, but elsewhere, to real estate issues. The government is moving to regulate all kinds of problems that it has shied away from in the past, and it's doing it really, really aggressively. Some of the actions are quite understandable to many Americans. For example, many aspects of the crackdown on the internet, although they're often written about as though it's an attack on capitalism, in many ways, the Chinese government is just doing what a lot of Americans think should be done with Facebook and Google in this country, which is to put some control restrictions in place on how companies use algorithms to target customers and the sort of surveillance capitalism. There's also a concern with leveling the economic playing field. China is one of the world's most unequal societies, and that isn't a fact that sits well with the Communist Party. But many of these actions are also extremely aggressive attempts to wrest back power for the state and for the Communist Party in particular. And many of the restrictions that are now being placed on, for example, internet companies, it's unclear what the net result will be. And there are those who say it's going to dampen entrepreneurialism in China. And there are others that argue if it's done well, what you'll end up with is a country where the engineers are busy designing silicon chips and useful hardware, such as drones that can automatically hunt down American military equipment or something. And they'll spend their time doing that kind of hardware development rather than innovating new social media platforms. But we're in the midst of all of these changes right now in China. And for many of them, I think it's too early to tell what the results will be.
Great. Thanks, Jeremy, for getting us started. And let's examine a little bit where we've come from in the relationship and how we arrived at this point. Professor Thomas Schwartz, you're a historian of U.S. foreign relations. Our history with the People's Republic of China is complicated, wrapped in Cold War, global politics, trade and investment developments, and much more. Can you talk us through the recent history of the U.S.-China relations to remind us of the elements that go into the current engagement?
Thanks, Pat. Yeah, no, I thought about this at the beginning. I thought, yes, it's the PRC is the main area, but we go back with China quite a long way. The United States sponsored the open door with China back at the turn of the century, supported Chinese territorial integrity, believed itself to be a patron of China. American missionaries were very active in China in the early 20th century. American traders also active. The United States supported China during World War II. There was a great deal of sympathy for China against Japan during the war, and many Americans served in China in various advisory capacities. In 1949, when the People's Republic came into power, it was part of the Cold War. And the PRC coming into power initiated a period of hostility toward the United States, which grew particularly intense after China intervened in the Korean War. The United States then did fight China for the first time in its history, some very severe battles. I noticed the other day that one of the most popular films in China this week is one that recounts a battle that China won during the Korean War against American forces. So there was a period of great enmity during the Cold War, particularly in the 1950s and 60s. The United States sponsored the rival government, the government that fled China, that landed at Taiwan, the nationalist Chinese government. And the United States protected that government from possible Chinese invasion in the 1950s. There were some quite serious nuclear tensions between the United States and China during the 50s, when it seemed like China might try and attack Taiwan then, or the offshore islands even. Our intervention in Vietnam, in part, came about because of a fear of Chinese expansion and Chinese power in the region, particularly. That did not take place. China, in fact, plunged into its Cultural Revolution and expelled most of its or cut off most of its ties to the world for a time. The great change in U.S.-Chinese relations happened 50 years ago in 1971, when Henry Kissinger went to China on a secret trip that set the stage for President Nixon's famous trip to China in February of 1972, one of the most publicized events in our history at the time. That switch in China's loyalties from being a loyal communist power with the Soviet Union to being a de facto ally of the United States during the Cold War would shape our relations during the 70s and 80s. China also took advantage of its position as a part of as a de facto ally to change its own economic orientation. The Communist Party stayed in power, but effectively a capitalist system came to rule in China that allowed for rapid economic development. That stalled a bit in 1989, when there was a challenge to the regime, which was put down fiercely at Tiananmen Square, one of the most memorable events in the U.S.-Chinese relations that cooled our relations with China for a few years. But Deng Xiaoping, who was the leader then and who orchestrated and allowed the crackdown to occur, though followed a policy that aligned itself back to the United States, and especially in trade and economic measures. And Chinese economic development proceeded swiftly in the 1990s and 2000s. China entered the World Trade Organization in the early 2000s. Many Americans hoped that economic progress and transformation would lead to a liberalization of the Chinese regime, and that was the great hope of the early 2000s. That has been disappointed. In many respects, the great financial crisis of 2008, 2009 emboldened Chinese leaders who began to see their form of control and capitalism as superior to the West. And Xi Jinping has been a strong proponent of Chinese nationalism and Chinese assertion of its power in the world. That has also led to the Belt and Road initiatives, to Chinese attempts to develop a stronger position within Asia. And in effect, that finally led in some ways, and one could mark the election of Donald Trump as a particularly turning point, but it was happening even sooner, of disillusionment in the United States with China and to a desire for a more confrontational policy, particularly economic tariffs against Chinese goods because of a feeling that Chinese trade had undermined American manufacturing and led to serious job loss in the Midwest. Trump promised a trade deal, which he got, but it was at the same time as the pandemic broke out and relations began to further worsen. And in some ways, the Trump administration began identifying China as a foe of the United States. That has been one of the few areas in which the Democrats have actually shared in that view. And the tariffs have remained on Chinese goods. The sense of China as engaging in a competitive relationship with the United States, the fear of Chinese economic and military developments, the degree to which Chinese authorities have cracked down on the Hong Kong's democracy and undertaken persecution of the Uyghurs has also soured the relationship. And recently, this has particularly been intensified over Chinese military threats toward Taiwan. So we have a history. It's been a history of ups and downs, of periods of great cooperation, but now we seem to be entering into one of great competition and rivalry. And whether that will be a Cold War or not is, I think, the challenge now that we seem to be facing.
Well, the question of a Cold War is certainly one that we'll drill down into a little bit tonight. I suspect there will be a topic of interest in the Zakaria broadcast as well. The U.S.-China relationship is a multi-layered affair, but the challenges boil down to a competition between leading global powers. Much of that competition and cooperation is in the area of commercial ties, the massive trade between China and the U.S. John Scannapieco, you're an expert on the business-to-business piece. Despite tensions, trade with China has not ended. This isn't a Francis Fukuyama, the end of history. Trade continues. So walk us, if you would, through the state of the economic relationship.
You're muted, John.
Thank you. I reminded Pat and I forgot myself, but in any event, but you can't discuss the U.S.-China economic relationship without, I think, an understanding of kind of the cultural and political and historical perspective. And I think both Dr. Schwartz and Jeremy did a really good job of kind of discussing all of those things. But you can see how those have had an impact, I think, on where we are today. As Dr. Schwartz mentioned, with the Trump administration and imposing tariffs on a significant portion of the of U.S.-China imports to the United States, China then retaliating on U.S. exports to China, The U.S. now fearful of Chinese companies gaining access to what I'll call U.S. critical and emerging technology, has adopted all sorts of new laws and corresponding regulations to curb China's access to this technology, in areas of, artificial intelligence, energy, critical telecommunications and networking, and even advanced computing. China, though, always tit for tat and has responded with its own laws and regulations around, and in fact has adopted its own legislation that would be very akin to our CFIUS rules, also adopting data privacy laws, export control laws. So, you can see this now, this tension that has given between the two countries. So you'd think after hearing from Dr. Schwartz and from Jeremy that when I began to say, oh, economically, this is all, going slowly downhill. But in fact, economically, trade is at some of its highest levels. It's approaching, if it's not hit an all-time high in some categories, it's approaching pre-pandemic levels. You have still significant U.S. investment into China, while Chinese M&A in the United States has dropped precipitously, as well as in inbound investment. You're still seeing pretty strong investment here, in the United States. But at the same time, from a political, I think the political ramifications being that President Biden, again, as Dr. Schwartz mentioned, really can't lift the tariffs because otherwise that would be perceived as weakness on China. And if there's one thing in this country that people seem to agree on is we need to be tough on China. So I don't think you'll see any movement there through at least the midterm next year and really probably beyond, unless something significantly changes. And at the same time, while Jeremy, I think, is correct that President Xi is probably in the best place he's been in a while, there are still groups within China, I believe, that would like to see market reform, to go back to that time before this kind of a resumption of more state control. And so, again, not wanting to look weak, then has to retaliate. Again, saving face in response to all of, I'll say, the U.S., this action. But again, as I said, you'd think this would be maybe a bad time. But I was looking at, and I wrote down some numbers here. I was looking at Amsterdam, China, Shanghai's 2021 survey of their 338 members, and about 78% were optimistic or slightly optimistic on the 5-year business outlook. And that's a return to the numbers that we saw in 2015 to 2018. 77% reported profits in 2020. 82% projected higher revenues in 2021 than 2020. So manufacturers that are producing in China, 72% did not have plans to move any of their manufacturing out of China. And of the remaining 28%, only 1.6% said that they were going to remove all of their production from China. So again, we're seeing really strong, I think, sentiment of businesses operating in China. And if you look at the U.S.-China Business Council, their 2021 survey, and that was 107 of their members that responded, again, a majority said they're profitable, and more than 40% plan to increase their investment in China. However, that doesn't mean everything's rosy, because again, I think some of the issues that both Jeremy and Dr. Schwartz highlighted, U.S. companies rank U.S.-China relationship as the top challenge for their businesses operating either in China or with Chinese companies. State support for Chinese companies and the regulatory barrier that China has imposed, that they impose, I would say, disproportionately against non-Chinese companies, all make doing business in China, difficult. We're also seeing now economic nationalism in both China and in the U.S. And so as a result, retaining Chinese workers, for example, is becoming more difficult as more and more look to Chinese domestic companies because they perceive it to be a better way to advance their careers. But again, I'm optimistic about doing business either in China or with Chinese companies. I believe you need to understand the ecosystem. So you need to understand what the rules are and how those rules are being imposed on non-Chinese companies, so on U.S. companies, and then go out and get the advice and retain professionals with significant China experience to help you now kind of navigate that minefield. In the last year, we've probably drafted manufacturing agreements and supply agreements that over the next, say, 5 to 10 years, and several billions of dollars worth of products coming from China to the United States. We've handled over probably $3 or $4 billion in Chinese investment coming in to the United States. So, I mean, business is there. I believe, a lot of this, we talked about the politics, but a lot of this is political theater up here, maybe designed for their respective audiences. But at the end of the day, the businesses, I mean, we're so interdependent that I just don't see that changing unless, we something happens that just causes it's a mistake more than anything else. Because I think we both need each other. China, being under-resourced, needs to sell its goods to the U.S. because it needs that foreign currency to then buy the resources that it needs to keep the lights on and keep the wheels turning so that they can retain that control. So I'm very optimistic. I just think you have to be smart about what you're doing and understand what you're doing because it is. I mean, you are swimming with sharks, but I think it can be done.
Great. Thanks all three for our opening context and background. I'm going to move around from topic to topic and invite our panelists to jump in, but I'll direct the question to one in particular, but all three can gang up on the issue. John, let me follow up. You talked about the interdependence continues. We're seeing tremendous disruptions in global commerce. Traditional on-time deliveries have been impacted by shipping delays, labor shortages, and other impediments. Can you give us a little more granularity as to the global supply chain relationship with China? And we can acknowledge that a lot of the cause of the problems we're having with dozens of ships backed up at Long Beach is American domestic issues, not enough truckers, not enough rail cars, et cetera. But talk about that connection between the U.S. and China, the supply chain, which is getting a lot of attention in the last year or two. You're on mute, John.
In January of 2020, you started seeing, when China started shutting down because of COVID, you had you had a supply shock. So we couldn't get goods from China. Then as China was recovering, you had a demand shock around the rest of the world. As a result of that, you had the shipping companies. Waylay ships. So they were putting mothballing ships. At the same time, China was shipping PPE literally all over the world. So to markets where they didn't traditionally, send goods. So now you have containers that are stuck in maybe Africa or South America or in other places where there's not enough goods coming from those places back to China. So you're short all of these shipping containers. And so that has really caused, I think, a significant, in terms of the backlog of getting, say, goods from China to other parts of the world. You also had, at the same time of the pandemic, manufacturers just shut down. And so they depleted their inventories of, say, raw materials, right? And then once we started to recover, we recovered as a whole, all around the world. So you had to backfill your inventory. You then had an increased demand for basically everything all over the world. And so all of that coming together now has created at least this backlog of being able to get raw materials, of being able to produce goods, and then of be able to ship those goods from China to, say, the United States. And then, as you touched on, there is a shortage of truck drivers. there is, and also dock workers and all the rest. And this is causing a backlog, but it's also due to just the increased volume. I was listening to a podcast the other day. They're at the Port of Savannah, and they were saying how just the volume of goods coming in was like 50% more than they would normally see. Then you tack on all of these issues with offloading and then moving the goods. And then you have warehouses that are totally full. So even if you had the trucks, you can't move the goods. So I think all of that together is what is causing this. Now, when will this end? I've seen anything from middle 2022 to even into 2023. It'll be interesting to see. I know some of the logistics providers that I spoke to, they're only getting about 60% of their requested containers for next year on their contract. So it looks like, to me, it's going to extend out even beyond maybe 2022.
Well, we'll hopefully see enough presents under the Christmas tree this year to get us through. But that's a good insight into how all that works. I've got an area that I'd like to know more about. And Jeremy, as the editor-in-chief of SupChina.com, and I get your newsletter. It's terrific to be able to keep up with the developments, even just scanning the amount of material that you produce. That accompanied with your decades-long experience in China, you've followed the course or the evolution of Chinese regimes from the last, I would suppose, 25, 30 years with great interest. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in the leadership in China in terms of global aims, economic, military, and political, and what do we know about President Xi Jinping's goals for the future of China?
There we go. Still learning to unmute myself after all this time. He has been quite explicit about his major aim, which is the great rejuvenation of China. In his words. And to understand that, I mean, we should have a little bit of historical context, why not the rise of China, but the rejuvenation. And it does tie in with a question Tanya Gonzalez asked in the chat about the Chinese mindset to do with never forgetting national humiliation. So what is often referred to as the century of humiliation was basically the end of the colonial period, where China was, being picked over for its assets by foreign powers, where it was very weak. It was behind technologically, and it ended up as characterized as the sick man of Asia. It both entered and exited the Second World War as a country where most people were illiterate and starving. And where foreign powers had, run amok for, a century. And recovering from this has been a big part of Chinese sort of national myth building since the Communist Revolution in 1949. But Xi Jinping has made particularly the focused on rejuvenation. In other words, China's already stood up under Chairman Mao, as they used to say, and it got rich under Deng Xiaoping. Now it's time to rejuvenate, and it's time to essentially for China to take its place on the world stage. And if you look back over, several thousand years of Chinese history, for most of human history, China has been one of the richest and most technologically advanced nations or groups of people on the planet. And for many Chinese people, including Xi Jinping, reclaiming that status is very important. So I'd say the big picture is Xi Jinping wants China to be great again. But how you get there is sort of complicated. How do you make China great again? You have to make it respected and feared, and that's got something to do with a lot of the military saber rattling and the growth of the Chinese military, new technology, just this week, a hypersonic missile apparently being tested by China. You also make it economically strong. But much of it is also inward directed. You know, at the top of the hour, I was talking about these crackdowns on companies and especially the technology industry. And some of this is Xi Jinping wants to make many of the things that are weak inside of China, wants to fix them. He is the most ambitious political leader on the planet right now, and he's dreaming really, really big. And, you know, sad to say, while we in the United States are fighting about face masks and vaccinations and gendered pronouns and, you know, millions of other things which may be worthy, in China, there are big things afoot, and the people in charge have a plan.
Well, that's interesting insights into where China is going, to make China great again theory. I think that's a good bumper sticker for a lot of what we're seeing. And Tom, let's talk a little bit about a point you raised, the Cold War, whether this is or isn't. And I think you left it as a question, but let me put the question to you. Is China the new Soviet Union? Are we looking at a Cold War with China? And if so, what does that mean?
Well, I think the analogy is one. David Sanger has a piece in the New York Times talking about how strongly the Biden administration resists using the term the Cold War. And you started our program by talking about how President Biden, of course, said we're not in a new Cold War and all of this. So there is this desire to avoid that terminology because of what the Cold War connotes. The Cold War was essentially both an ideological and a nuclear weapons competition. The Soviet Union and the United States represented different ideologies, quite different ideologies, and they also built nuclear weapons till they had enough to destroy the planet. 10,000, 15,000 nuclear weapons, both, that were aimed at each other, and that, had they ever been used, would have killed most people in the world. And
Down.
that we seem to be facing in terms of a competition that could be seen as a Cold War. I actually found the fact that China sent 3 astronauts up to a space station to be another echo of the Cold War. One of the reasons the space race got going was this idea that the United States needed to compete with the Soviet Union, which had launched the first satellite and then the first man into space. And now China and the United States have competing, or seem to be wanting to compete in space as well. There are echoes of it in so many ways, but I think there are some profound differences. We are so economically interconnected, and what John said about the degree of trade, we never approached that with the Soviet Union, that economic interconnection between us, the way it is with China. It's very likely also that it would be very difficult to find allies or to have a strong ideological bloc of countries that wanted to align with the United States. Most countries want to be able to trade with both. Even in Asia, this is also, the desire is not to choose between the United States and China. So there are competing aspects that make this different from the Cold War. Our vocabulary will probably have to come up with a different description to probably best capture it. But it does seem to be a type of competitive relationship, at least in certain respects, and ways in which one looks at the nature of the Chinese state, ways in which one perceives Chinese interests and the threat, for example, to Taiwan. But it is not quite the Cold War of the US-Soviet Union style.
Well, talking of about Taiwan, Jeremy, you talked about Xi Jinping and his ambitious goals, and how did you phrase it? The most ambitious leader, dangerous leader in the world?
Oh, done it again. I think I said ambitious, yes.
Okay, very good. I wouldn't want to misquote that of that import. But on Taiwan and this notion of conflict between the United States and China, um, is Taiwan on Xi Jinping's short to-do list?
I fear that it is. It's, when this topic comes up, there seem to be two types of views that are common in China watching circles, journalists, think tankers, politicians. The one is the sort of Chicken Little view, kind of panicky view that, oh my gosh, the Chinese are going to invade Taiwan tomorrow and there's going to be a war tomorrow. And there's often a sort of a thread of breathiness that runs through them. But the opposing view also seems to me a little bit perhaps not in touch with all the realities, which is to say, actually, the status quo is working very well for everybody and nobody would really want to do anything to disrupt the status quo. And the reason that I am uncomfortable with that view is that Xi Jinping has now developed himself, something of a personality cult around himself. He's on the front pages of the party and state newspapers every single day. His name is always the top headline on the state-owned news services and propaganda services. His thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics is making its way into elementary school textbooks. This is, in other words, not a guy with a small ego. And he is directly setting himself up as somebody who's an equivalent in stature to Deng Xiaoping, and even more, especially to Chairman Mao, to Mao Zedong, who, in the Chinese communist pantheon is the uber god. But what has Xi Jinping actually done? I mean, you could say that China is running very well now, and it's dealt with various challenges over the past 10 years very well. But I mean, none of these are particularly stirring achievements. Oh, he kept interest rates at, property prices didn't fall, and, everybody got a little bit richer so they could have one more Starbucks. And, okay, he banned video games, so at least my kid isn't playing video games, for 40 hours a week. But I mean, none of these, what stirring achievements are there? Chairman Mao liberated the country and, showed foreigners that China wouldn't be jerked around. Deng Xiaoping made the country rich. So if he doesn't take back Taiwan, and reunifying, as they call it, the motherland is a major part of the mythology of the Communist Party. If he doesn't do that, I don't really know what he can do to ensure that he truly has a place in the pantheon. So that's what worries me. So that's why I wouldn't, I don't sleep that easily at night when thinking about this question.
It seems in the last couple of weeks, Taiwan has been a big issue. The Chinese military has flown a number of aggressive flights into the Taiwan air defense identification zone. And there was a lot of conversation about the US being drawn in and responding. Let me throw this open to the three of you. What is your sense, looking at the American body politic and the ambiguous policy about coming to the aid of Taiwan? What do you think would be the American response? John, do you have any thoughts on is America ready to send 4 aircraft carriers and 3 bomber wings to the Western Pacific?
If you look at it, I think from just the pure politics of it, and look who is now running our government, they're such China hawks that I would not be surprised if that would be the way that the politicians wanted to go. Now, coming over to the military side, I don't know if we're in a position to really in the sense of defending Taiwan in the way that I think would be necessary. Just from, and again, I'm not an expert on the military or even the politics. This is me just from, my business trying to understand the politics and the military and how they would respond. But I think it would be very difficult. But I can definitely see this current group of politicians all wanting to take, how do you say I'm tough on China if they invade Taiwan and then you don't do something about it, and imposing sanctions or whatever? I just don't think that's going to cut it. And that, to me, may be where we get ourselves into trouble because of just the way American politics works. That these folks, they're afraid they're going to lose if they either on the liberal side are not liberal enough, or on the conservative side they're not conservative enough. But there's one thing they all hate China. So I don't want someone to hate China me and get myself, lose my seat that's making me all this money. So I don't know, that maybe is a naive kind of businessman's approach to all of this, but that's how I see it.
The only thing.
Go ahead, Tom.
The interesting thing, I had a Chinese student the other day who raised this question in class and said that she had been to a Taiwan at a Taiwan university where the professor raised the question of whether the students thought the United States would intervene to protect Taiwan. And all the students said, yes, of course the United States would try to protect Taiwan. But then she had also been in an American classroom, and the president raised that question, or the teacher raised the question, and none of the American students thought we should protect Taiwan. So I'm not so sure that John's right on this. In effect, there is a strong constituency for not interfering that would also come into play here. The Taiwan issue raises a lot of very profound issues about America's identity. Does it defend a country that is a democracy? Afghanistan had all sorts of problems there, but even there, supposedly Americans had said, oh yeah, it's all right to get out. And then when we got out, a lot of Americans felt very disgraced by the way we got out and the manner in which we left. And it certainly not helped Joe Biden at all to have gone out that way. So public opinion could change on a dime. So it's not clear to me exactly how we would come down. A lot of it would depend on how China went about this. I think if China were smart, of course, it would probably try to get Taiwan in a manner that would be difficult for Americans to intervene, namely through sponsoring strong pro-Chinese unification party in Taiwan, perhaps making offers, in a way muddying the waters. An all-out invasion would be, I think, a more difficult undertaking in the sense of raising the question, and especially if Taiwan resisted and fought and did not surrender immediately in that sort of manner. It would certainly stir up feelings in the United States that would be passionate that America has to defend democracy and this type of thing. But I do think it's dangerous. I think this is where the idea that we could get into a war without really recognizing what might happen is certainly there. A provocation, something could happen in the Straits that would create that type of conflict.
Jeremy, I think you're on record as being uneasy about what's going on there. So let me add another dimension to the military equation between China and the United States, and that is the United States in recent years, last year, has developed something called the Quad, which is a loose affiliation of India, Australia, Japan, and the United States, and most recently something called AUKUS, which caused a ruckus with the French, and the news was mostly over submarine contracts. But in the context of U.S.-China relations, this is a brand new defense pact designed to exert military coordination and cooperation and power in the Indo-Pacific region, and it's Australia, UK, and the United States. How does that figure into the equation, looking out from Beijing as they see people ganging up? Clearly the Chinese position in recent years has been more aggressive. I was in the foreign ministry, and and we were having a nice visit with a World Affairs Council delegation, and it was very polite, and there were kind of softball questions to the senior foreign ministry official. And being a retired naval officer, I asked the impertinent question of when will Chinese aircraft stop interfering with reconnaissance flights in international waters, and that caused a ruckus. And I would have thought in the foreign ministry there'd be a little more diplomatic response, but it was pretty aggressive. So tell us about these defense pacts, and what's the view from China about this ganging up?
They play straight into a narrative in Beijing that the US is trying to prevent China's rise, I think, and that it is doing that through all means possible, ranging from, sanctions against, Huawei, trying to block Huawei from the US and other markets, to AUKUS and the Quad and these new military developments. In some ways they're not wrong. AUKUS and the Quad, these developments, although they never put China in their founding documents or their public statements, it's very clear that China is who they're talking about, whatever they're talking about. The strategy in the Indo-Pacific, it means China. So in some ways, Beijing is not wrong to see it like as the US trying to orchestrate constraints on its power. But I guess from Beijing's point of view, these are very unfair attempts to slow its rise.
John, let me, we're closing in on the top of the hour here, but let me return to the economic questions of the day. How should US businesses view the current and likely future evolution of trade and investment with China? What's out there in front of us that might be a little more optimistic?
Well, I think what
Thanks, Jeremy.
They need to understand that we are in this age of competition, and with that now is going to come great regulation to ensure, for example, that China and Chinese companies don't get access to what the U.S. deems to be critical and foundational technology or emerging technology. I mean, this is all, and from my perspective as a businessman, this is all about who controls this critical technology, because that technology is literally the foundation for the next 50, 75, 100 years of the next generation of business. And this is, if you look at the United States, they want, right now we are number 1 or 1A in pretty much all of these technologies that have been identified as critical. China, okay, as we've heard from both Dr. Schwartz and Jeremy, or even from Jeremy, make China great again, or something along those lines. I mean, they want the same thing, because that's how China is going to be great, and that's how China is going to ensure its greatness going forward. So I think businesses just need to understand there is going to be regulation, there are going to be barriers, there are going to be some challenges, but like any business, once you understand that, then you factor that into your business plan. And so you're seeing it now, whether it may be an increase in prices, or they're absorbing the increased cost of doing businesses and all the rest. But again, business just has to understand that the ecosystem, both in the U.S. and in China, and then adapt to fit both of those ecosystems if they want to be successful.
Well, let me, we're short on time here, but I want to get a plug in for Professor Schwartz's book, the Henry Kissinger, An American Power Political Biography. Tom, you've written a terrific book on a political biography on Henry Kissinger, who was the architect of the opening in China. And he summarized much of that history and his outlook in his book on China. Give us, if you can, in 2 minutes, your assessment of Kissinger's views on the current situation and the future relationship with China.
Well, Kissinger at one point would have been called a sort of panda hugger. I mean, he was someone who was very much involved with China, very convinced of China's significance for American foreign policy, believed that the the turning of China was a key factor in pressuring the Soviet Union and ending the Cold War. So he certainly played a key role in the economic opening of China, both in his company that Kissinger Associates in terms of its consulting, and he's often been used as an intermediary with the Chinese government. I think what Kissinger fears is a sort of pre-World War I association. One of the things that existed before World War I was a rather extensive trade between Germany and England. Both countries were Europe was economically a place where people traded in these sorts of circumstances. That didn't stop war from breaking out. So in that sense, economic interconnections in business doesn't necessarily prevent political leaders from, in effect, sleepwalking into war. And Kissinger's great fear, I think, is that the United States and China could also, through this misunderstanding, since both of them see themselves as sort of countries that want to be great again, to borrow that usage, that they both could be on a collision course. And so his great plea is for them to develop ways to understand, to find common interests that they can cooperate on, as well as compete with each other. So I think his concern is he's grown quite pessimistic about this, the fear that we are moving toward a type of new Cold War, and is still hopeful though that the United States and China can sort of head that off. And I think that is the great challenge, really, that he sees.
Jeremy, I'm going to ask you to take us up to the top of the hour, and I'll express thanks to you and Tom Schwartz and John Scannapieco, and we'll flip into the Fareed Zakaria broadcast at the top of the hour. But Jeremy, one of the principal concerns of the United States is the humanitarian picture in China, and we've labeled what's going on with the Uyghurs as a genocide, a very powerful terminology to attach to a humanitarian issue. We're 4 months and change to the Olympics in China. There's noise about, boycotting, et cetera. So give us the context of what's going on in this humanitarian back and forth. Is it something played up when we want to poke China, or are there teeth in the American resolve to address that issue?
It's difficult to know. It certainly, and in the Trump administration, it was played up to poke China. I think the genocide designation itself, which was not, uniformly accepted by scholars, was seen as a way of, poking particularly aggressively. There wasn't any, there hasn't really been much follow-up to the rhetoric, though. I think that some of what's going on in China right now, particularly with the Uyghurs, has caught the attention of the world and is very much to the detriment of China's image globally. And maybe that actually matters more in other parts of the world than in the United States. But I don't really get the sense that human rights have much of a place on the Biden administration's agenda when it comes to talking to China. And the fragmented civil society actors that are trying to organize around human rights causes are generally, fragmented and without much power. So I think the human rights issues in China are kind of going to be something that is put in parentheses for the next few years, whether that's right or not.
Any last comments while we wait for the Fareed Zakaria broadcast to pick up? John, any last thoughts?
Yes, I think one of the things we've heard a lot of great information today, and I think, I tell this to a lot of my clients when they're doing business in China, maybe for the first time, tell them you got to take off your American glasses, and you can't just evaluate everything that is happening in China or coming out of China through the lens of an American, because China is not the U.S., and Chinese citizens and Chinese government leaders are not U.S. Government leaders and citizens, and you need to really put yourself in the shoes of, or at least try to view it from the perspective of China, look, I could work in China for another 30 years and I will never understand China. I try to get glimpses of it here and there, but I feel like if you can at least try to look at what is happening, I think it will help you evaluate and understand better and help you make better or more informed decisions when it comes to your business, how to do business in China or with Chinese companies, and really understanding even sometimes where the government is coming from. I think it's very, very helpful. And that's where, and I'm going to put a plug in for Jeremy, where what he is doing is so helpful. And it's such good information because it really, there's somebody, folks on the inside helping us get a glimpse of what's happening. And it really does help make, better decisions and better choices. So that would be what I would like people to leave people with. And, don't look at China as the enemy. It's just different. And, there is going to be this competition, but I think we can get along and be very successful together.
Yeah, I'll double down on that and highly recommend that people visit supchina.com and subscribe to the newsletter. Jeremy's the editor-in-chief there, and he and the team do a fantastic job of keeping people up to date on what's going on in China.
That's very kind of you, both of you.
You're quite welcome. It's a great service that you all are providing. Tom, any last thoughts before we roll out of here?
I feel like I learned, especially with hearing from John about the degree of economic connection. That was a bit of a surprise. I would have thought there'd be more of a deterioration, and it just goes to show that politics. There is a sort of theater in politics that politicians play to domestic audiences, and business can go on without any changes, and that's fascinating in some ways. I'm not sure what it portends, and certainly World War I is not a great example on that score, but it's still fascinating.
All right. Well, we are extremely thankful for Professor Thomas Schwartz, distinguished history professor at Vanderbilt University, Jeremy Goldkorn, editor-in-chief of supchina.com, which, as you've heard, we can't recommend more highly, and John Scannapieco, attorney at law and expert on international business, building bridges between businesses, and especially in the United States and Asia. And John, I promised I would mention that you've got kids to go to college, so you've got your shingle out. And anybody looking for
my kids are pretty.
Anybody looking for a fantastic attorney to get them involved in business with China, Japan, Europe, and in the meantime, as the honorary consul of the United Kingdom, I'm sure that you could provide great recommendations for finding a pint of Guinness in Nashville somewhere. Well, we're going to
lots happening between the U.S. and the U.K. So that's a whole nother podcast.
Okay, well, we'll tee that up for another time. Again, thanks to you three. We've had a fantastic hour of conversation, and we're going to switch to the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. I've got a screen open. They haven't started yet. We will put that in our Zoom box here, not our boom box, our Zoom box. And you can stick with us and continue to chat and enjoy it via our connection, or you can look in your chat box here and find the live stream link and just watch it in your browser or your phone on the way as you head out, or however is best for you. We do have maybe another minute or two before they come on there, and I think that's about it. Jeremy, did you have something more to say?
I'm good. I've depressed everybody, so I'll keep quiet now.
Well, I enjoyed your chuckle when I used the word optimism in relation to John, but No, this is what makes these invaluable, is to hear the insights and perspectives and the back and forth between experts on these topics. So we're pleased at the World Affairs Council to bring this conversation to you, and we hope that you will continue to watch our programs. Take a look in the youtube.com/TNWAC video channel. There is a wealth of great material in there, over 100 webinars in the last year. And our podcasts are in the Global Tennessee series, wherever you get your podcasts, or you can go to soundcloud.com/TNWAC. Our website is tnwac.org, and you can become a member there or drop a nickel in the bucket, and we will greatly appreciate that. So I will hope to be adroit enough here, gentlemen, to switch to Mr. Fareed Zakaria, and I think we're probably in a hold pattern with that broadcast. But thanks again to you three, and we will be back with more programs with these distinguished speakers in the future. Good night.